接下来演讲邀请主持人王祥讲研发长以及主讲人 Professor Dr. Raymond I'd like to invite the speaker, Professor Dr. Raymond and the host R&D Chief, Xiangchen Wang.
Hello, everyone. My name is Xiangchen Wang. I come from National Zhongzheng University. Okay, so now I will start this session. So this session we welcome the Professor Raymond. So let me introduce Raymond. Raymond is a teacher professor at the Buffalo University and has been teaching postgraduate course on the public affairs at the Science Pole. And his research focuses on the trend organization, management, and international relations for the Institute research on the interministerial coordination for the trend policy making at the central government level, financed by the Swiss Science Foundation, and the research on the impact of funding of the global health through the preventive funding source, financed by the Swiss network and the international study. So today we are very honored to welcome the Professor Raymond. So his speaker title is about the SDGs and PPPs for the green technology adaptation. So let's welcome the Professor Raymond.
Share screen?
You can start talking.
Share screen, yeah. Huh? Hello, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm delighted to be able to make a presentation on a topic that is very important to us, and I think it's also an important topic for you. We've been working with the United Nations since the beginning of the SDGs, that is since 2015. We've been researching, publishing, running workshops. So there is a foundation based on the knowledge that we have acquired over these years, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. My topic today is SDGs and PPPs, public-private partnerships for green technology adaptation. I am myself a titular professor at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, and also co-founder and director of the Center for Socioeconomic Development, which is a Geneva-based foundation going back to 1993. So here are the key messages of my half an hour presentation. The first one is the 2030 agenda will be presented with the 17 SDGs, and it will be also shown they're indivisible and also valid for every country, not just for developing countries, for instance, but whether north or south, east or west, at the global level, every country. The 17 SDGs are interdependent. Thinking of just silos of doing one or two SDGs and leave the others aside would be self-defeating because they're all connected. But we have to, it's a complex task to see how they are connected and how to best make this connection work for you. 3, the financing of the SDGs is a formidable challenge, particularly now, after 2.5 years of COVID. Now the war in Ukraine, which is affecting, of course, lives and also food commodities. And on top of it, the geopolitical competition, for instance, between the US, China, Russia. All this is affecting also trade and international cooperation and international development. The key SDGs that I would like to talk about today is particularly SDG 17. 17 is about partnerships, and it has 19 targets. I will say more about that shortly. So we have started in 2015 with the SDGs, the so-called 2030 agenda. 2030 because at 2030 it will be the end of the SDGs. We're about midway through, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Now, the idea of the SDGs is it is a 3 dimensions which are together should be tackled, and that means we should think of how to create our economy and our society in a way that there will be economic and also for business, economic sustainability, there will be ecological sustainability, the environmental issues, but also social development and social sustainability. These 3 dimensions should be seen as being one package, one whole strategy for developing our countries. The SDG implementation, the way to do it is to do it in an inclusive manner, in a participatory manner, and also in a transparent manner. The idea is no longer that experts will do everything, and then afterwards society will either benefit or not from what the experts have come up with. It is already at the start, society and private sector should be consulted, so their views could be integrated in a country's strategy. And every 4 years, countries have to evaluate where they are in terms of the SDG implementation. In addition, every year we meet in New York. There's the so-called high-level political forum where countries show what they're doing, and it's a lot of learning and comparing, which is a very good opportunity to see what else could be done differently at home. And in addition, I have to say also, it's not just countries. Now, 4 years ago, it started with cities who also want to have their one day of show and tell to explain what they do at the city level in terms of implementing the SDGs. That's also a fantastic moment to be in New York and to hear what the other cities and countries are doing. Here are the 17 goals. I'm sure you've seen this now many times. So let me go further and come back again what I said just before. The idea of the 2030 agenda is to have a house, a roof, based on 3 columns. They are equally important to keep the whole house together. And they're, as I said, indivisible, and they're all interdependent. So we at the very beginning, when talking about strategy, it should be already a comprehensive, integrated, 3-dimensional approach to SDGs. Here you see that the same concept just shown in a different manner. You have, again, the 3 dimensions. At the top is the economy, and which of the goals are linked to the economy. Then the society, the social sustainability, which of the goals fit with that. And at the bottom, the foundation could say, the biosphere, nature, oceans, that's the basis for us to live our lives and to make it into the future. Now, all of this, of course, costs money. And the financing of SDGs has become a big concern. First of all, already in 2014, UNCTAD calculated there's about $4 trillion that are required every year for developing countries to achieve their SDGs. Now, given the current levels in all SDG sectors by both public and private sector, the developing countries face an enormous funding gap, estimated at 2.5 trillion US dollars per year. And of course, now, again, as I said before, with COVID and the other complications because of the war in Ukraine, financing has become even more difficult to generate and to find, especially for the developing countries. So an IMF study by Vítor Gaspar et al. Made the following comments, saying that in order to unlock large amounts of resources in the developing countries, there should be 5 key areas or sectors, if you want, that need to be developed. It's like an infrastructure strategy that includes education, health, roads, electricity, water, and sanitation for all countries, developed or developing. These are key physical and social infrastructure elements of our development. They need to be improved, or they need to be, in that sense, built, especially in developing countries. How to finance it? So they estimate that for the low-income developing countries, there will be altogether what means 0.5% of their GDP, global GDP, should be made available for financing the SDGs in these countries. Or we have 2.1 trillion in emerging market economies. Emerging market economies could be like the BRICS, India, China, Brazil, South Africa. So that's their situation in terms of finding the money to finance their SDGs. However, if looking at this in more detail, it would mean we have about 4% of their GDP, or the equivalent of 4% of their GDP, should be made available to finance the SDGs. It's quite something. And more importantly, at the bottom, you see the estimates for the least developed countries, the so-called low-income developed countries, the poor countries. And we have about 55 of them worldwide. For them, it would mean that about 15% of their GDP should be put aside to engage in SDG development. Now, I think we all agree. First of all, they're poor, and in addition of what is left in terms of their accounts and their budget, to put aside 15% is just enormous. They really, in that sense, depend on support by the developed countries. Now, how to go about financing? Vítor Gaspar and his colleagues suggest there has to be some way to get more money, and that could be done through an increase of taxes. Now, this coming as a suggestion from colleagues from the IMF is quite something, because in general, the Bretton Woods institutions will be suggesting the opposite, to reduce taxes. But in light of the challenge of actually implementing or trying to implement the SDGs, it's clear money has to be found, so to speak, to finance it. And some of that could come through tax increases. And tax increases are not easy to do. We know all of that, right? So we have to have a strong government who can explain why there will be tax increases, for what, not just to grab some money from its citizens and then spend it in unknown manners, but that it's clearly earmarked for funding of the SDGs. Now, how to go about with infrastructure development? As you can see on this figure, from left to right, there are different ways to finance infrastructure development. This goes back to a paper from OECD, which is still holds very much. It's a useful picture, a useful concept to discuss and to then agree how to go about doing infrastructure development. It could be done by the government. Let me remind ourselves, when we look at Scandinavian countries, for instance, first the citizens pay a high tax, sometimes 50, sometimes even more than 50%. But their governments deliver what they promise to do. And the people, the citizens, are happy what they get from the government. Hence, the government can do most of the infrastructure development by itself because it can finance it. If that's not the case and there's not enough money, of course, there is the possibility to do a public procurement, a call, and companies submit tenders, and then the one that is judged to be the best tender, the company then creates, works on the infrastructure, gets the job, gets the mandate to execute the project. But once finished, it's finished, it gets evaluated, and the company gets paid for the work it has done. PPP is a different story. Private-public partnerships could also entail co-ownership, so that a company, for instance, which creates a new road, gets to have for 20 years or maybe even for 30 years the right to request toll taxes from the cars that use the newly built highways. And so for a limited amount of time, but still it could be 20 or 30 years, the company is in that sense in charge of the highway, and at the end has to give it back to the government. There are also concessions or even privatization. These are ways to think about how to finance and how to go about financing and developing the infrastructure projects. There are different kinds of infrastructure. Let's just remember, right? We have the so-called physical infrastructure, energy, transportation, telecom, water, classic. Social infrastructure, health, education, social services. But we also have political infrastructure, institutions, laws, and administration. Sometimes countries decide that, for instance, for vehicle inspection, that's done through a private company and not by a government office. On security infrastructure, armed forces, police, and some countries, the police system and the prisons are given to a private sector company which runs it. Of course, there's a heavy debate whether that's good or not good, but these are possible ways to think of infrastructure and how to finance and how to develop it. Now, here is just a list of different kinds of PPPs, legally speaking. And most people and even governments are not necessarily informed as to the implications if they go, for instance, for four. It's called build, own, and operate an infrastructure project. What does it mean for the private sector company, but also for the government? The government has sometimes to co-finance it, but also has the responsibility to make sure that the project, especially if it's a 20 or 30-year project, and inevitably governments change and maybe private sector companies have new managers, that the project is executed and delivered as agreed at the beginning of such an infrastructure project. But when opting for PPPs, there should be a consideration as to whether or not the civil servants in the Ministry of Finance or in the government in general, also the line ministries, do they know what PPPs are? What are the implications for the government, but also for the private sector? Say in some of the line ministries, like say the Ministry of Transportation, excuse me, or ministry in charge of ports or electricity, telecom. If it's a big project, of course, people in that ministry should also have experts who know how to engage with the private sector company which will be delivering an infrastructure project. So there should be capacity building, there should be ongoing training, because people don't necessarily stay in government forever, right? They come and maybe move on after a career opportunity appears, and hence the new people coming on board have to be trained so they can do their job, which is to supervise that everything goes out right. Financing, just a final slide here. Say, let's not forget, if we opt for PPPs, it basically means that maybe we have a great arrangement with a private sector company to build a road or port or telecom unit, but the next generation then has to pay up. So it is an offloading of a big responsibility that the younger generation, which is not necessarily participating in a decision about infrastructure development, they're the ones who will have to pay. And hence we're talking among experts how to better include the young generation so they're not put in front of a fait accompli and maybe at the end refuse to pay. Here you have another way to think of the SDGs, grouped in the so-called 5 Ps, right? People, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. As you can see, some like people, that would mean including or looking at goals 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Planet would be 6, 12, 13, 14, 15, and so on, to cluster the different goals within these 5 concepts can help when discussing within society, but also among the people in charge of implementing the SDGs. Where do you want to emphasize? What do you want to emphasize? What needs to be done? More about people development, more about prosperity, or whatever the country's needs are. That helps to group the discussion within the context of the SDGs. Another one important aspect, the goals, as I said at the beginning, are interconnected. They affect each other. And this chart here was done by a colleague of ours at UNDESA in New York. It's showing, as you can see, how the goals are interconnected. And the size of the circles also shows the importance of these specific goals that are very much connected with other goals. So there is the discussion about policy trade-offs. You know, it cannot do everything, it's clear. Countries and cities also should decide what is most important. What are the goals that need to be most, developed? And that means by deciding to go for these goals, of course, the other goals have to take a backseat, not to be forgotten, but to come in maybe 3 or 4 years later. That's an important strategic decision for countries, but also for municipalities. And then here is also what a company can do. It's not a matter only of governments. Companies can do their best to implement the SDGs. Here you get to see an example. There's the co-roundtable from Tokyo who produced this chart. And you have to understand this and read it from left to right. It's the production process of a food, just an imaginary food company, which buys food, or let's say commodity, wheat, rice, then processes it, then creates out of this food items. The food items afterwards are packaged, transported, brought to the market, so to speak. There's distribution systems. They're sold in the market, used by customers, and the company at the end discards what was left over from the production process. And each one of these steps of production is also holds for any other sector, not just food of food companies, right? There are a company could analyze where is the company? Is it more up? This is the sign is positive, meaning these SDGs that you can see here, 4, 8, 2, 3, 2, are being positively used and implemented throughout the company's production process. Versus negative means these are concerns. There is something not right, be it how the company relates to its workers or employees, also the environment, the working conditions. This would be, in that sense, taking stock where a company is and what can a company do to improve its footprint and contribute in that sense to the SDG implementation. You have afterwards, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can see how each one of the goals for companies, what it means, and how a company should assess whether it's doing well or not, and how it could be, in that sense, improving its footprint. That goes to here. And now another one at the end to close is 17. 17 is the SDG about partnerships. It's the biggest of all the SDGs in terms of big here, meaning the amount of targets that are part of 17. And it's about resource mobilization, participation, and helping the developing countries who, as I already mentioned to you before, don't have the money to do it, but maybe have the interest, but they need to be helped. And then to do investments, to find the right kind of investment in the different infrastructure. In the website of the United Nations, you will see here, that's the concept, right? To help each other, to put the parcels together, to make it a win-win or multiple win-win partnership. 6, 7, and I highlighted 7 because it also is about to promote the development, transfer, dissemination, diffusion of environmentally sound technologies. That's the green part that we also wanted to highlight, that we do when investing, let's invest in green technology and in green products. That's 17.7. Then we have capacity building, 17.9, and trade, 17.10. 17.11, unfortunately, was missed. We're supposed to help the least developed countries increase their share of global exports. That has not been achieved, and we need to do much more to help them become part of this so-called ship that is embarking on going on towards better futures and not to be left behind. What I'm working on, have been working on for the last 4 years, is 1717, which is not just PPP. If you read it carefully, it says, encourage and promote effective public-private, and civil society partnerships based on experience and resourcing strategies and partnerships. So it could be the government, a private sector, and a cooperative, as an example, or a community organization who could partner with each other to create a meaningful project. Data monitoring and accountability, it's about to increase significantly the availability of high quality and timely and reliable data disaggregated by income, gender, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, and so on. This is often in the official statistics, it's just all put into the same pot, which makes it meaningless if one wants to collect the data and to see how things are going and what needs to be improved. So as one of the closing slides, you have here, it shows in the middle actionable impact themes. The next ring around it is by basic needs to empower people, climate change, nature's capital, and governance. And then the different SDGs are grouped in the third ring to fit these 5 major strategic concentrations. And it makes sense when you look at it in more detail. Let's say basic needs. Of course, it's no poverty, zero hunger, good health, clean water, and so on. This would be, I'd say, the thing that the information that should be put on the table when governments take a decision as to what to focus on and where to put their money in terms of SDG implementation. Last slide, you see here from the World Green Building Council how these different SDGs, 3, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 13, 15, and 17, can contribute to a green economy. That's basically my closing slide. And of course, we should have more time to discuss this in more detail. But I would like to say thank you very much for your attention. And we look forward to staying in touch with you. Goodbye.
Okay, so thanks for the Professor Ramasona. It's a very impressive talk. So I have any question here? Because Professor is still online. Okay. So have any questions? So Professor Sona here, can you hear my voice? Professor.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I hear you. Okay. Now I have one question about in your slide. You talk about the greener model. So how to differentiate about the greener model? Can you understand my question?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
Okay. In your slide, you talk about the greener model for sustainability. So how to differentiate about the green model?
I think the easiest way to answer your question is by going back to my last slide. The last slide, I don't know whether you can go back to it.
Okay, you back to the
Biomass to
the last.
You look for and yeah. So of course here you see how the different goals that are at the bottom, they're indicated how they could contribute to a more greener economy. And you see each of the goals, the 17 goals, are broken down into targets. And the targets are measured by indicators. So by analyzing the goals' targets, you can identify which targets contribute most to a green economy and a green future. And I would say the most important part, of course, is also to measure. The indicators should be part of a strategy how to turn, for instance, Taiwan into a more greener economy. Then the promise to do more, let's say about goal 12. As you could see, goal 12 could generate a lot towards a green economy, for instance, through circular economy concepts. But in general, the most important part, I would say, is to look at the targets of the goals, identify which targets have the best promise to contribute to a green economy, and then decide on the strategy, because you also need to spend money to reach these targets. As I said at the very beginning, everything costs money, which is natural, but to then focus on those targets which generate most green impact, and then find ways to finance it. And for the citizens and for society, the whole thing should be, as I said also at the beginning, inclusive, participatory, transparent. And the transparent part here will be to let the public know how these strategies will be implemented and how it will be measured. Whether all the money spent, all the good intentions and strategies, whether they have reached the intended outcome.
Okay, and I know your explanation. Okay, so have any questions here? Okay, so if no question due to the time limitation, let's thank the Professor Sona again. Okay, thanks for the Professor Sona.
感谢主讲人 Professor Sanger 以及主持人王生成研发长。Thanks to the speaker Professor Sanger and the host R&D Chief Wang.